They told me revenge would empty me. They were wrong. If you listen to this story all the way through, you'll want to play it again, and you will want to subscribe, because some secrets deserve a second hearing. They called it the Camden Promise, a narrow, rain-streaked lane between two Georgian terraces where decisions were made and fortunes broken. I moved to London with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn idea that the world could be fair if I worked hard enough. I left because of one man and returned because of another. This is not a story about fists or knives. It is a story about patience, the quiet, horrible patience of someone who learned to wait. My name is Clara Merrell. Once, I was nobody. I taught classes in an evening school, made coffee for other people's interviews and took the bus across the city so I could afford to eat. I believed in small courtesies, saying hello, holding a door, returning a book on time. Those courtesies are the scaffolding of a civil life. Then came Victor Hale. Victor wore a suit that smelt faintly of lemons and arrogance. He had a laugh that closed a room. He was the kind of man who could persuade a committee and then forget the promises he made afterward. He owned half the board that sat above me at a tech firm called Altair Innovations. I had been hired as a junior UX researcher, one among many, and I thought the work would be a ladder. Victor turned it into an escalator that ran away from me. One project changed everything. We had built a prototype, a modest, humane app that helped elderly users order medication. It was unimaginative, honest, and it worked. I poured months into user interviews, designing simple flows for people with failing eyesight, testing colors until they felt warm. When our prototype was presented to the investors, the applause in the room tasted like entry and hope. A week later, the app launched, not by Altair, but by Victor's new company, NovaCare. He had left quietly, taken a handful of engineers and, crucially, the idea. My user notes, my sketches, my names, all vanished into a company that paid me nothing and thanked me with polite emails. Finding out felt like watching the familiar street where you grew up replaced with glass overnight. I complained. HR smiled. The law was slow. Victor smiled again. He called it evolving opportunity. I called it theft. The senior staff took his side because he carried money and people liked being carried. I lost my job within a month. The reason? Redundancy. The truth? I had made enemies at the top and I had nothing at the bottom. Grief is a messy tutor. For 2 days I screamed into my pillow, and on the third day I did something more dangerous, I watched. Not the violent cinema of revenge, but the quieter thing, observation. Victor's public life was tidy, the private life was a map of fingerprints. He loved 3 things: attention, appearances, and chess. He posted pictures of his philanthropic dinners, his new office, the opera where he claimed he had season tickets. He liked appearing to be the kind man who bought suits for orphanages. That facade was his shield. Shields can be turned. I took a job washing dishes at a bistro in Bloomsbury. My hands learned to work in hot water and my head learned a different kind of patience. There, between plates and evenings, I started building a new ledger, one of small facts. A name here, a recurring charity there, the quiet way his assistants answered the phone. I read investor blogs, absorbed annual reports, sketched the network of companies around Victor like a spiderweb under my lamp. Revenge, I decided, would be effective only if it was invisible and inevitable, a truth that unfolded slowly until everyone saw it and no court could argue with the obviousness. I would not smash windows. I would remove the props from his life, his reputation, his leverage, his illusions. Imagine a house whose foundations dissolve not with a sledgehammer but with termites. First, I built alliances. You do not topple a man like Victor alone. I reached out to former colleagues who had been pushed aside, the shy engineer who'd left for Berlin, the project manager who'd been forgotten. I found users who had trusted us with their precarious health details and were furious when a corporate logo appeared where a compassionate team had been. I found a journalist who preferred truth to tenure. We traded notes. We shared grudges, which are the rawest currency. Second, I found the soft spot. For Victor, it was his awards. He cared more about the plaques than the product. The city liked shiny objects. Every year a panel would hand out a prize, a ribbon of legitimacy. I filed FOI requests, read board minutes, and reconstructed the timeline of each accolade. A pattern emerged: discrepancies, hurried filings, phantom consultancies. Third, I used his own language, the language of metrics. He'd always boasted about retention, engagement, and growth. These numbers, I realized, could be curated. If you could show a narrative in the data, you could change the story people told themselves about a product. I taught myself to read user logs, to identify bot-like patterns, to spot where vanity metrics had real decline. The plan unfolded over a year like a long, careful chess match. We drip-fed information, a leaked email here, a contradicting statistic there. The journalist wrote an article about the launch of NovaCare and the odd absence of actual user consent language in the early days. We made sure the article landed not in a small blog, but in a paper that mattered. Simultaneously, we nudged regulators. I compiled user testimony, elderly people who had been enrolled in services they hadn't asked for, calls from numbers that didn't match the privacy policy. The compliance team at NovaCare had assumed goodwill. Their legal counsel assumed that a company with money could blunt any complaint. They were wrong about the size of the chorus. Victor's first reaction was denial, then bluster. He gave interviews where he smiled like a man who believed his smile could bend truth. But in the background, contracts were scrutinized, investors asked for audits. The awards committee withdrew a fellowship. A photo of Victor at an earlier gala was scrutinized and an unacknowledged sponsorship surfaced. Each small revelation was a stone. You must understand, this was not sudden. People began to whisper. Boardrooms felt colder. An investor I had once served coffee to emailed to say, "We're pausing due diligence." It was precisely ordinary and therefore, brutally effective. When the board paused, projects stalled. The team began to bleed talent. NovaCare's PR put out statements that smelled of bleach, clean but sterile. He tried to strike back. Victor hired a firm to spin the narrative, to bury clauses under legalese, to bring high-profile endorsers to the table. He invited me, out of pity or calculation, I couldn't tell, to an event under the guise of reconciliation. I went not for the wine, but to watch. He pressed his hand to my arm and apologized in the language of lectures, polished, uncommitted. The day we released the internal memo was the day the city noticed. It was a carefully redacted set of emails that showed how features had been moved from Altair to NovaCare weeks after Victor's resignation. The memo was not a roar, it was a litany of dates and signatures that a journalist could not ignore. We presented it to regulators and to the press. We placed a copy in the inbox of an assortment of people Victor trusted. The emails were precise, unembellished. There was no dramatic flourish, only evidence. The papers printed the story. The internet argued. But more importantly, the people who mattered, those who underwrote his deals, began to ask awkward questions. Contracts with municipal partners were paused. A keynote speech at a major conference was rescinded. The collapse was not instantaneous. It was slow and bureaucratic and therefore incredibly humiliating. Victor's company shrank like a bad photograph left in the rain. Board members resigned with carefully measured statements. Employees fled to competitors. The awards committee released a statement about new information, which was a polite way of saying we were duped. I watched it happen, and I cannot say I felt joy. Revenge is not fireworks. It is a winter night that reveals everything previously hidden by light. What I felt was an odd and settling quiet, like the hush after a long storm. Someone called me a vengeful woman. Someone else called me a truth seeker. I answered neither. Labels are for the living who like to put a neat tag on something complicated. Here's the piece no one expected. Victor did not leave the world empty-handed. In the wreckage he found something that he claimed as his own second act, a philanthropic foundation. He spoke about redemption in interviews and talked about learning. He got a new board, smaller, humbler, and he began to speak in the language of counseling and care. The city, being fond of narratives, liked a redemption arc. Some people forgave him. Others didn't. The paradox was that the same public that had cheered his ascent now liked the idea of his fall and resurrection. Humans are inconsistent. But this is where my intention stayed true. I never wanted him to be destroyed beyond repair. I wanted accountability. I wanted those who profit off other people's labor to understand that there are consequences. When Victor rebuilt, he did so in public view. His foundation required independent audits, binding oversight, and a clause that ensured user privacy was enforceable by an external body. The very mechanisms he had once bypassed became the scaffolding for his new enterprise. What did I gain? I gained work that mattered again, but not by stealing. Former colleagues reached out. Investors who valued integrity called me to ask if I'd consult. I started a small practice advocating for ethical product design. We built an oath, designs that prioritize dignity over clicks. Revenge, in the way I undertook it, taught me an odd humility. To hold people accountable, you must sometimes become the historian of small cruelties. You must keep a ledger. The law is slow, but truth has a way of aggregating. This story travels easily across oceans. The rules of power, small cruelties, and public reckonings are recognizable whether you're in New York, Berlin, Paris, or Manchester. If you live in the United States or anywhere in Europe, you'll see the same conversations about ethics and technology, about celebrity and accountability. Share this with someone in your city. These are not just stories, they are maps of our moment. If this story hooked you, and you felt that slow heat of satisfaction when the truth unravels, then there's more like it here. Subscribe for stories of small justice, for tales where patience is the weapon and clarity is the victory. Tell a friend who likes long-form narratives. Play this again if you missed a detail. Secrets bloom on second listen. Remember, systems are designed. People can be designed too. When they are cruel, the cure is not always fire. Sometimes it is a notebook, a quiet team, and the stubborn work of telling what actually happened. They told me revenge would empty me. Instead, it taught me to write better endings, for myself, and for the small, ordinary people who deserve them.